I was just saying downstairs there's a very overused term of art, or maybe not art, for moderators, as in these people need no introduction. Let's just say, even though it may be overused, for the two people to my right, it is appropriate. Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, chroniclers of American history for a couple of decades now, really producers of some unparalleled films. And how many people here, may I ask, just to start, have been watching any? Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm not a critic, but just in my humble opinion, you have really produced, in probably a work of unparalleled difficulty, just a masterpiece. So congratulations, and thank you, and welcome to the Asia Society. We also have with us a pair of protagonists, if you will, although that's not nearly enough to describe them. And here I would say...
Antagonist. I'm an antagonist.
So, but perhaps for some of you, if you haven't, well, even if you've just seen a couple of episodes, you'll know a little bit about Duong von my Elliott, who is just to Ken's right, and Tom Vallely, who appears later in the film and is also a senior advisor to the film. But I wonder if I could, rather than my introducing them in any way, my Elliott, if you wouldn't mind, just focus, if you would, on something that really doesn't get that much play in the series, and just talk about the extraordinary ways in which this conflict divided your own family.
Yes, the Vietnam War was a civil war, and its origin started during the French period, when Vietnamese were divided about how to get rid of the French and end French colonialism. At that time, a lot of people joined the Viet Minh, headed by Ho Chi Minh, because they saw it as the best way to throw the French out of the country. And so a lot of Vietnamese families were divided. In my family, my older sister joined the Viet Minh, and that division lasted all the way till the end of the Vietnam War. So it's a story that is not unique to my family. A lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of Vietnamese were divided this way, and but it's a story that is not well known in many parts of the world. And it's a story that the Vietnamese government right now doesn't want to acknowledge, that in fact it was a civil war and that family were divided.
So we'll come back a little bit later to how that resolved within Mai's family. Tom Vallely, again, you have a distinguished place in the film, both on screen and off, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Tom has said the first time he went to Vietnam, quote, "I prayed every day to go home. Second time I went and never really came back." Can you explain in brief what you mean by that?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. People often say to me, that I love Vietnam. Well, actually, I don't. I went back to Vietnam in 1985 to make a television commercial about myself, so I could run for Congress and prove that I was braver than the poor person I was running against. That part of my career never developed. When I came back from making that trip to Vietnam in 1985, Joe Kennedy had decided that he wanted to be a member of Congress, and I had no chance of defeating Kennedy and John F. Kennedy's seat in Congress. So I got out of politics, and I became interested in Vietnam because I had gone back there to basically use it as a backdrop. You'll see some of this in the film in a couple of days. And so I became interested in Vietnam, and then I made contemporary Vietnam a career of mine at Harvard. And that's how I got connected to Ken and Lynn, and how I helped them identify people in Vietnam that would be part of the film.
Yeah, and I should say there's a member of Ken and Lynn's team, and I should also say, I think you all were made aware, but Senator Bob Kerrey was initially going to be part of this program. He had a funeral he had to go off to in Nebraska. I don't think it's fair to Tom to call him a stand-in for Senator Kerry. He will, as you've already heard.
He's a very dear friend of mine.
Yeah, okay. But someone on the team said to me, Tom Vallely has probably done as much for reconciliation between the two countries as anybody. So we thank you for that. Now, Ken and Lynn, one thing is
we're done now, Mike. All right. We're finished. Okay.
There was a little.
I think you should run for Congress now. I think there's a space.
All right, we're finished. Okay.
There was, and just so that folks understand, there was a pre-program discussion about, when you have Ken Burns and Lynn Novick on the stage, how are the others going to get any time? I promise to be judicious in that regard, but however, I have to ask you, and I know you've been asked before. So much of your prior work has been mining things long ago, not parts of our history or the world where film and footage and pictures have necessarily been seen in such abundance. And someone reminded me not long ago that actually about 30-some years ago, there was on PBS, no less, a 13-part series, Vietnam War history, based on the Stanley Carno book. So it's a long way of saying why. What made you jump into this?
Well, I think in some ways the Civil War series has cast such a big shadow that the presumption is that we only deal with stuff in the 19th century. But in fact, most of our films are in the 20th century. Most of our films avail themselves of ample footage to complement what we still believe, regardless of what century we find ourselves in, the DNA that still photographs represent. But with regard to the central part of your question, the Vietnam War had always been kind of intellectually, for both Lynn and me, an important topic. I'd lived through it. She had sort of come of age, sort of feeling its presence. But we talked about it as filmmakers doing it, but it wasn't until we were finishing our series on the history of the Second World War that in 2006 that I said, we have to do Vietnam. And she said, okay, what part? And I said, all of it. And we both kind of gulped because we realized this was going to be a decade-long commitment and clearly the most challenging, but then, again, the most satisfying of our professional lives. War always reflects, in a very, very fine degree, who we are as human beings, not just in the obvious bad ways, but in unexpected good ways. And we're always finding in the interstitial moments of our exploration of war something that is more complicated than we thought, something that makes the conventional wisdom that all of us have about a particular event kind of evaporate out of its inability to really convey the complete picture. So Vietnam literally was a siren that beckoned to us. It is the most important event since the Second World War in American history, and so much of where we found ourselves in 2006 when we began, and particularly now, accidentally for us as filmmakers, where we find ourselves now in 2017, the seeds of all of that seem to have been planted somehow, cultivated, and propagated from the Vietnam experience.
You just said most satisfying of all the work you've done. Well, why?
I think when you tackle a complex narrative and figure out, you believe, I guess, or presume that you believe that filmmaking is kind of additive. And it is. You build a film together, but it's more often than not subtractive. We have thousands of hours of footage. We have tens of thousands of photographs that we've laid our hands on. We have hundreds of hours of interviews. We've got a whole mass of stuff which we then have to boil down and identify. Of the 100 people that we interviewed, the 77 other people besides these two extraordinary characters in this film, who's going to be on camera? Who are the historical lives that we're going to cover, that we're not going to do John Kerry and John McCain and Henry Kissinger and Daniel Ellsberg and Jane Fonda in interviews, but they're going to be fully dimensional figures in the portrait we're going to tell. How do you master what that is? How do you take advantage of 42 years of new scholarship that has completely upended most of that conventional wisdom? How do you take advantage of the access to Vietnam and the ability to talk to people who are now saying things that they would have never dared to say a decade ago or 2 decades ago that stray from the official party line? How do you get American veterans who've been unusually reticent? I talked to someone today who said, I got home from Vietnam, I survived, I went to law school, and I never told anybody anything. Never said anything about what I was doing. and where I'd been. It took a while for me to understand that in order to get well myself or to be healthy, I had to begin to talk about it. So we benefited also from a generation of Americans who were willing to talk about it. And so we had this rare opportunity to triangulate a multiplicity of perspectives that were permitted us to not just follow the same old dialectic of one thing or the other, but a more complex and nuanced thing. And when you are able to do a kind of the documentary equivalent of a Russian novel, and you get through it, and you're alive, and people like it, it's the most satisfying thing.
That was a really good answer to that question. Lynn Novick, you get a lot of credit for, on the Vietnam side of this, for first of all insisting that there be, I guess, equal representation. I'm struck watching, and I have now seen all 10 episodes, that as compelling as the Americans are in this film, you not only found Vietnamese voices, South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, but they're certainly as compelling. And can you talk a little bit about that insistence and how it was brought to fruition? And I know Tom played a role as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we felt from the beginning that we didn't want to we didn't want to recapitulate one of the central mistakes that got us so deeply involved in a very difficult and impossible situation, which was not understanding what was going on in Vietnam, who were the Vietnamese we were fighting with and fighting against, and our leaders weren't terribly interested in that at the time, or the people who were marginalized, however you want to talk about it, but it was not essential. It was a question that was asked repeatedly but never really answered, and it sort of underlay a good deal of what led us so deeply astray. So as filmmakers, everyone on our team agreed that we had to try to find a way that our film would not make that same mistake. What that actually translated into was many years of work. Sarah Botstein, our producer, who's not here today because she just had a baby yesterday. We're very happy for her, but she was a big part of that effort as well. Yes, beautiful pictures. Figuring out, how to talk to people in another country about their experiences, who to talk to, and to know enough about their lives to just open that conversation. We did some reading some fiction and nonfiction. There's not a lot written for American audiences that really sheds a lot of light on this, to be honest, so it really involved going there. And we had the great good fortune to partner with Tommy and his team at Harvard, and he introduced us to a colleague in Vietnam and to the Vietnamese government officials that were open to our process. And the idea was the same as here. We want to tell the human story of the war. We're going to talk about it from the top down, but we also want to know what was it like for ordinary people, good, bad, and ugly. Every, families, as Maya was saying, divided, just the whole picture. So the Vietnamese officials that we spoke with said, well, we in Vietnam, we don't really think about the war that way. It's sort of it's not a story about human beings in that sense. So we're going to be curious to see what you can find, and we think that it'd be great for the American people to know. It will help our cultural diplomacy, and it will help our countries understand each other. And we made many trips to Vietnam with a number of people with and without camera crews and talked to people like we do here. Really, it's the same process. It's really just keeping an open mind and listening and spending time with people and trying to figure out who they are and what they want to say. And it was revelatory there and revelatory here. Mm-hmm. Got to know some remarkable people. And, the similarities between soldiers, they have many of the same feelings American soldiers did. And then some big differences, too, because I think for Americans to understand in Vietnam, you walk around, if anyone here has been there, you don't see the war is not everywhere. It's basically nowhere. Mm-hmm. You have to look and you have to talk, and it's not something that's at the top of everybody's list to talk about. But when you scratch the surface, you find that everyone in Vietnam knows someone who died. Yeah. So the scale of tragedy is epic and incomprehensible.
Tom, did you, at that stage when you were first contacted, did you think it would be sort of on the scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the ease of finding people who would not just be spouting government line and be like that?
Well, tonight you'll see in tonight's episode. I'm in tonight's episode, and I'm in tonight's episode at war. Okay, but I learned about the Vietnam War at 7th Avenue and 31st Street. So I show up at Florentine Films And I had served in the war. I knew pieces of the war. I knew parts of the war. But at the Florentine Films office on 7th Avenue and 31st Street, there are 10 storyboards that have the story of the Vietnam War on them. And they have in it certain battles they want to cover, which I didn't know much about. So they have Ap Bak and Bin Za and A Drang. And they say, okay, now I'm getting to see for the first time of my own personal education about the Vietnam War. And Lynn's being a little bit modest. We did help them identify who, in sort of detective work, who fought at Ap Bak, who was a commander at Hill 875. And we put these people together, and I think what was really impressed all of us was how Lynn and the team at Florentine Films and Ken, they interviewed maybe 80 people in Vietnam, but they selected who they wanted to fit on that story they had already developed, that frame. And so watching them put I remember, Lynn said, I need that person. And then sometimes we'd have to go find someone who was at Hill 875. And we found someone at Hill 875. We saw him last week. We showed him part of the film. He's the last person alive at Hill 875 in Vietnam.
Took a year to find him.
So that's how my own education is not what you see tonight. My own education was working at Florentine Films, which was the best history department in the world.
Wow, that's great. We're going to show some clips, by the way, in a moment. But Ken, one more question going back to your own engagement or involvement at a young age. So you were, if I'm not mistaken, 11 when the first ground troops come to Vietnam, 21 when Saigon falls. You've spoken about these last 10 years as dredging up, I think your term was an inner conflict. You got a draft card at one point. Can you talk about what that inner conflict meant and how it came up in the last?
Well, I think it's been sort of overplayed. Everyone here will find it as a prize that things get overplayed in the media. I lived on a college campus. There was, a tremendous amount of anti-war fever. I'd already been through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which woke me up. I mean, you couldn't be in 4th grade and spend 7 hours in the basement with your head, in Delaware with your arms behind your neck, waiting for Armageddon and thinking you're never going to see your parents for dinner, or to watch a president get assassinated and all of that sort of stuff. So I was pretty attuned to what was going on, and my father was opposed to the war. The anthropology department at the University of Michigan in the spring of 1965 was instrumental in creating one of the first, if not the first, teach-ins there. I sort of remember that excitement. And I also remember sort of reading the paper every day and watching the evening news with my dad every single day to find out what was going on. I had a high draft number, thank goodness, but leading up to that was a source of tremendous anxiety about conscientious objector status or whatever. But I have to say that none of that figured in to anything that had to do with making this film. That was baggage lost super early on this long, around-the-world trip that we've just taken for the last 10 years. I mean, you always want to make sure that you are aware of the baggage that you bring or the particular bias that you might have, and we all have that, and the film will betray a kind of collective biases of us in moments. More often than they're not, they're artistic and not have anything to do with the political dialectic that controls us today. But the rest of that stuff we left behind in large measure because of what we discovered was so startlingly new and upside down that it kind of made whoever you thought you were before sort of obsolete. It didn't matter because what you knew was such. I mean, Tommy talks modestly about sort of coming into our New York office or the editing room about and learning about the war that he participated in. As you'll see tonight and tomorrow night and in our last episode, he's a hugely important central figure. It still bothers me that he's the only person in 40 plus years of making filmmaking that has given us the name of 2 episodes in a row, tonight's episode and tomorrow night's episode, and it galls me to have to admit how central Tommy has been.
Can I get another question?
To this whole process. But in point of fact,
does he get an extra fee for that?
We knew nothing.
Yeah,
we knew nothing.
yeah.
We knew nothing.
All right, so let's go to some clips now. The first one is really about, it's about my Elliott, and it's about how it comes to pass that this young woman from Vietnam winds up doing research for the Rand Corporation that would work its way up the corridors of power in the Pentagon. So if we can play from episode 4, My Elliott.
I was brought up to believe that the communists were people who would destroy the family, destroy religion, and people who had no allegiance to our country, but to international communism. My mother would describe them as đầu trâu mặt ngựa, which means that these are people with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse, meaning that they were subhumans and they were brutal. But on the other hand, I thought they also include people like my sister Tang and a lot of my cousins. I couldn't quite reconcile the two images. But of the two, I think the other image was much stronger because I was so scared of them. I thought, these people must be really, really horrible people. That was the frame of mind I had when I started doing research into the communist movement.
Duong Von Mai was the daughter of an official in the South Vietnamese government and was now married to an American, David Elliott. Back in 1964, she had gone to work for the Rand Corporation in Saigon. The think tank had been commissioned by Robert McNamara to do a study of enemy prisoners to find out who are the Viet Cong and what makes them tick.
I remember my first interview. I was by myself. I was very young, and I was going to this pretty grim prison to interview this high-ranking cadre who had been captured. I went in thinking I'm going to meet this beast, this guy with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse. He walked in and he was very surprised to see me, and just as surprised as I was to see him. Here was a man who had devoted all his life to fight for what he called a just cause, to free his country of foreign domination, to reunify the country under just government. So he really totally believed in it, to the point that he sacrificed his whole life to this cause. So I left, I was very impressed with him.
When the Rand report was presented to McNamara's top deputies at the Pentagon, describing the Viet Cong as a dedicated enemy that could only be defeated at enormous cost, one senior official said, "If what you say is true, we're fighting on the wrong side, the side that's going to lose this war."
Wow. I've seen that a few times. It backs a pretty strong wallop every time. My Elliott, can you, a couple of things. First of all, did you were a researcher, so it wasn't for you to come up with that overall conclusion, but did you agree with that conclusion, number one, and did you know at the time what had happened to your work in Washington? In other words, not much.
At that time, I was just a lowly interviewer. I was sent to the defection centers and to the prisons to interview these people. And my motivation and the motivation of the other interviewers was really to discover who we were fighting against, who were these communists. And, we knew they were committed, but we didn't know how the movement was growing, how the insurgency was winning at that time. So our hope was that this information would make the United States understand the war better and fight it better. So that was our motivation. And we had no idea how the Rand analysts were going to put all this information together, the responses to our questions together, and what conclusions they would come up with. So I didn't know that this went up the chain of command all the way to the highest ranks of the Defense Department in Washington, D.C. And when I heard about it, I agree with it, because I knew that the communist side was extremely committed, and our side was not as committed. And they had capable leadership, and we did not. And our leadership was incompetent and corrupt, and we always had this fear that the communists would win in the end. So it didn't surprise me when I heard it, but it was very disconcerting because it just confirmed what my deepest fear was at the time.
One of the things that we've talked about, sorry, one of the things that we talked about that's not in the film, but I thought might be lovely for you to share is your experience going with Martha Gellhorn into the hospital and seeing the casualties, which you didn't see in Saigon, and just who was actually bearing the brunt of the war. We show it visually in the film, so that's why we don't, but it's important because why were the people in the countryside so much more committed to the revolution? I think that's part of the story.
Yes. One of the lessons for me in interviewing the defectors and the prisoners were they were very, they were peasants from the countryside who had joined the insurgency. And at first when I went in, I thought these were just uneducated people who didn't know what they were doing, and they were just listening to the siren song of the communists. But when I talked to them, I discovered they had real grievances against the Saigon government. Their homes and villages were being shelled by artillery. Soldiers swept through their villages. Their families, their relatives were getting killed. Their houses were being blown apart. They had a lot of true grievances. So the communists did offer them a hope for a better future. So that's the first thing I learned. But living in Saigon, surprisingly enough, we were pretty insulated from the war. It was only until the Tet Offensive of 1968, when the war finally came to Saigon, that we had a taste of it. So I knew that there were people getting killed, maimed, and so on, but I didn't see them with my own eyes. So it was all very abstract to me. So when Martha Gellhorn, Hemingway's fourth wife,
but who's counting?
came to Vietnam.
Great war correspondent and writer. Right?
Yes. So she came to Vietnam, and she wanted to do a report on the war, but on the human side. What was the cost to human beings who were caught in this war? And I was recruited to be her interpreter. Wow. And she wanted to tour a hospital. So I went with her. And that was the first time I saw victims of the war. I saw women, children who had been hurt, burned, men with bandages, bloody bandages around their heads. I mean, the whole ward was filled with these victims of the war. It was really like peering into a hell on earth. So I was really shattered by it. So I realized that the cost of the war was borne by the peasants, while people living in Saigon, the middle class like my family, we were pretty much insulated. That's when I began to think that it's just a just thing. It's just right to ask the peasants to sacrifice themselves so that my family could be saved, from communism. That was the beginning of my change of the view of the war.
Now, there's another thing which, much has been, you've gotten a ton of acclaim, but one point that I think really rings true is that there's so much in here that even if you think you know and have read about the war, that you just think, wow, I had no idea, and this may betray my own ignorance, but it's not news that there were these early warnings, right? But the sheer volume that you produce and unearth here, I was struck by, there's testimony in one of the early episodes given by George Kennan, the great statesman, and it's not secret, it's full view there on Capitol Hill. I can't remember which year, but it's early. 56. So did you, Ken and Lynn, know that all this was there and you just went about trying to find it? Or did you were these revelations to you as well?
Mostly revelations to us as well. And in fact, our entire first episode is called Deja Vu, which is the hundreds and hundreds within that episode moments where the French experience completely parallels what will be our experience had we not listened to one of those and said, you know what? Or the advice even of our own OSS and later other diplomats that heeded our own advice. But throughout the film, it became important for us to complicate what was already a pretty complicated story. Mm-hmm. And that the more complication actually was better. And it's not to demand that you guys have to look at it more than once. You don't. I think we felt all the way through that I had no idea was the operative thing, or it's complicated if we were about to try to build that I had no idea moment. And so the film is built upon that. So it's collecting all the material, looking at 50 times that amount of stuff to find, and even taking what is a significant set of hours of that hearing and distilling it into what is the few seconds that you get to see, which is just devastating when you think that George Kennan, who is the architect of the notion of containment, would at this early stage for us have already come out so vehemently and definitively against what we are doing, as if we were some elephant frightened of a mouse, that we had no business being there. And you could think of, if we weren't there, no reason why we would want to be there. And you begin to see that you have a civil war, war for independence, of reunification, superimposed with this proxy war, this limited war, this Cold War mentality that screwed everything up. And Mai's, in the trenches, it's her interviews. And in fact, the background noise for that is, in fact, her interview, the tapes of her interviews.
Wow.
That is just the very subtle background noise of as she's describing that moment.
That's remarkable.
But so, that's what we're talking about from 30,000 feet, if you can say George Kennan addressing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is that, to the intimacy of a prison outside of Saigon where Mai is getting a kind of further set of doubts about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of intimacy, I guess since so many of you have been watching, you don't need me to tell you that the series is also built on just extraordinarily intimate, compelling interviews with a lot of people who served. So the next clip is John Musgrave, U.S. Marine, and Ho Hu Lan, Vietnamese soldier. Sometimes the series is tough to watch. I find this one kind of tough to listen to, but let's play clip number 2, please, from episode 5.
Fall of '67.
My hatred for them was pure. Pure. I hated them so much. And I was so scared of them. Boy, I was terrified of them. And the scareder I got, the more I hated them.
Tranh chấp giữa cái thương và cái tình cảm và cái lòng căm thù nó cũng có, sẽ đan xen ở tranh chấp, nhưng mà cái lòng căm thù khi đã đánh nhau thì cái lòng căm thù phải diệt đối phương là chính. Cũng là phải quyết tâm diệt chúng tôi, mà chúng tôi cũng phải quyết tâm mà diệt được cho nhiều địch Mỹ.
I only killed one human being in Vietnam, and that was the first man that I ever killed. I was sick with guilt about killing that guy and thinking I'm going to have to do this for the next 13 months. I'm going to go crazy. And I saw a Marine step on a bouncing Betty mine. And that's when I made my deal with the devil, in that I said I will never kill another human being as long as I'm in Vietnam. However, I will waste as many gooks as I can find. I'll wax as many dinks as I can find. I'll smoke as many zips as I can find, but I ain't gonna kill anybody. You turn a subject into an object. It's racism 101. It turns out to be a very necessary tool when you have children fighting your wars, for them to stay sane doing their work.
So, Tom, Vallely, I want to come to you on this one, but it seems this is a good moment maybe while you ponder an answer to just whether that kind of hatred was something you saw among your fellow Marines. But just to say, because it hasn't been said, Tom was a Marine Corps radio operator, 18 years old, just a couple of years later, 1969. His company was ambushed in Quang Nam Province, heavy machine gun fire. They radioed for help. He radioed for help, grabbed a rifle from a wounded Marine, took up a position 10 feet from the enemy, moved from Marine to Marine, pointing out targets, and there's much more to it. It's in the film. Awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Anyway, I did not have the John Musgrave hatred gene. The battle that you're talking about is a really well-armed, very disciplined NVA unit. And you absolutely need to fear them. But we respected them. We had respect for the North Vietnamese soldiers. And we definitely feared them. They had, you're surprised, they have really nice uniforms and, you know, really good weapons and recoilless rifles, and you think that this is a band of peasants running around Quang Nam province. They're a real serious army, and you know, we were afraid of them, and frankly, they were afraid of us. And I think in a couple episodes you'll see the tactical part of the war is we have this enormous power to win a battle using air power, artillery, Navy gunfire, but we can only use it if the North Vietnamese soldiers are far enough away from you. When they're really close to you, the term we use is they can grab them by the buckle. So when they get this close to you, you're definitely frightened, as Mr. Musgrave says, but you're in a real fight, and we cannot use our tactical air support because we will kill ourselves if we do it. So we just have to have a regular old-fashioned firefight, and it goes on and on and on, and both sides suffer greatly. Both sides suffer greatly.
And I think you said, if I'm not mistaken, it's not hatred certainly, and not even courage. It's you modestly say, but you're motivated by the fact you want to have grandchildren, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I like the Marine Corps. I felt that I was well trained in the Marine Corps. I liked the officer corps. We had very good officers. In this particular battle, all the officers are eliminated. But we knew what to do. We knew how to conduct this battle, and we also thought a lot of ourselves. We took great pride in not getting wiped out by the North Vietnamese. And we had learned lessons previously. You'll see some in the film where the Americans also learned how to fight. It isn't just that the North Vietnamese learn how to grab them by the Americans also learn how to fight. They fight really well. Now, they don't win as many battles as the sort of, you know, oh, we won all the battles. That's not true, all right? You know, they win some of the battles too. And so, but I think Musgrave is in a place which I did not experience, which is this constant shelling. So I didn't have the same experience in Vietnam as John Musgrave. Musgrave and others that are highlighted in the film are constantly shelled by artillery. We didn't have that experience.
And Musgrave, if you had not seen, goes on to have all kinds of
he has all sorts of
issues later.
Yeah.
So
he's seriously wounded. He's a terrific part of the film.
So it's again not news that there were great divisions in this country back then. I'm now teeing up the next clips. Maybe a little more or lesser known in this country that there were divisions in Vietnam. But first, if we can play the clip from episode 8. Which is, I guess, what came to be called, perhaps a little frivolously, the war at home. If we can run that one.
One, two, three, four.
I never considered the Vietnamese our enemy. They had never done anything to threaten the security of the United States. They were off 10,000 miles away, minding their own business. And we went there to their country, told them what kind of government we wanted them to have.
When I see the war protesters, I react on a couple of levels. Intellectually, I certainly understand their right to the freedom of speech. But I will tell you that when I see them waving NLF flags, the enemy that I and my friends had to fight, and some of my friends had to die fighting, that doesn't sit very well with me.
On November 15th, 1969, 500,000 citizens turned out against the war in Washington again. This time, buses provided an impenetrable wall around the White House. President Nixon claimed he was too busy watching football on television to pay attention. But he did suggest that Army helicopters might be used to blow out the marchers' candles. Hundreds of thousands of others demonstrated in San Francisco and New York.
All right, and maybe let's keep the lights down for a second and just come to the clip from Vietnam. My Elliott has already talked about civil war in her native country, fratricide. This is a tough one to watch, but if we can play this from episode 9 in Vietnam.
Từ năm 1970 trở đi, đối phương ở trên chiến trường là quân Nam Việt Nam, là người Việt Nam. Và bi kịch của nó là chỗ nào? Cái bi kịch của chiến tranh Việt Nam là bi kịch người Việt Nam giết nhau. Hỏa lực Mỹ nhưng mà là xương thịt là người Việt.
It was fratricide. You can say, well, but they are communists. Okay, they're communists. They are the worst Vietnamese in the entire world. We were the good Vietnamese. But let's face, Vietnamese killing Vietnamese. How do you deny that? If you don't call that fratricide, what do you call that? How do I explain that to my children?
So maybe, I mean, this is a question anybody can answer, but Lynn Novick, you talked a little while ago about there not having been much of a conversation in Vietnam, about the war, that it's in some places not. Can you talk a bit about how the film has been received and how maybe...
I think I would actually defer, I'll just briefly say that we had the whole film translated into Vietnamese, and it's streaming on PBS in English, Vietnamese, and Spanish, and the streams are available in Vietnam. So we have at least hundreds of thousands of people watching on the PBS site and other places as well. So we think that millions of people in Vietnam are watching the film right now. And I don't think when we conceived of the film that we realized that would be possible, that we could have it shown there without having to go through a broadcast system is really incredible. And we went to Vietnam recently and showed some clips and had some reactions there. But in terms of how people are reacting to the film right now, I think Tommy and Mai know more because they have their fingers on that pulse.
The film is, for those, Vietnam has about 53 million, population is about 100 million. It has 53 million active internet users. The word in Vietnam for internet is Facebook. Facebook is not, I would like to get some money from Mark Zuckerberg, so I need to be careful. I'd like to get in the United States, Facebook isn't that big a deal. In Vietnam, Facebook is the main act. It is the opposition. It is the delivery system of information. And there's now in Vietnam, just like there is in America, there's an active debate about the war and about history being told differently. So I think what they have in Vietnam is they have how history is looked at outside of the normal system that they would either go to school with or see their own history, even though their own history is a lot of it's propaganda and it's not real history, but that's what they're used to. So now we have, I'd say there's 3 million people that have seen it so far. Some, we're guessing, of course, but we know that they're having an active debate on Facebook now with each other, discussing, was it a civil war, was it a war of national liberation? So we're not trying to settle that, but we've sort of started a debate in Vietnam, which I think is going to add enormous potential in Vietnam for the reconciliation in Vietnam that has not happened yet. So I think it's a big contribution.
And my Elliott, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really struck us in going back was that hearing from just anecdotally a few small screenings that we had, that it's not only do they only get the propaganda version of the story, they don't see the images that we are so familiar with here of their own dead soldiers. They see the photos of civilians who've been wounded, but they have not seen the images that Americans are very familiar with of piles of bodies of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. We saw a few here. That was never shown there and still hadn't been. So the reckoning with the actual cost of the war is not an abstraction. It becomes much more real. And that's part of this. And that was certainly news to us. We didn't quite understand.
And I think a huge thing to add to that, what Lynn said earlier and what she just said now and Tommy intimated, which is that when the history of the state is sort of dominating the picture, you have a kind of monolithic singleness to it. There's no intimacy. There's no bottom-up. There's not a sense of, I felt this, I did this. It was the collective experience and the collective will of the capital P people who made it happen, which essentially denudes the story, the narrative of things that are true for the Vietnamese. Forget about the Americans. That they lived it, that people went, Bao Ninh lived in an apartment complex in Hanoi, and he was, the 6 people, young men drafted, he's the only person who went home. And he had to be quiet about that because it doesn't really fit into the narrative, grief or suffering or loss or the actual facts of it. And I think it's hugely important to understand that the possibilities of just opening up an emotional channel could be seismic there because you're going to say, oh, we own this war too. It isn't just the narrative that comes down from the state. We are a participant in this, and we can therefore ask questions. Why did we sacrifice so many people? Why was the decision made that we will not, as their leader Les One said, count the cost? These are hugely important questions for the Vietnamese to ask, just as we are now asking tons of questions across all the political spectrum about our own involvement and when and if it should have happened and what we could have done to have won and or not done to have won. This is a central question for Vietnam, and it's really important because we are a completely individualistic, narcissistic society, and we can't possibly imagine a story that doesn't have me at the center of it. And that is different from what the Vietnamese have, and it's an important to be able to place an eye to something was one of the great gifts of this production.
And Ambassador Burkhardt asked me at lunch, when are we going to get to the Paris negotiations? So in the next couple of episodes, you're going to see the Paris negotiations, and the citizens of Vietnam are going to see they should have given up too. They could have done something earlier. Why do we have Nick Negroponte on TV saying we had to bomb them into signing, accepting our concessions? So the Vietnamese public will see they should have negotiated differently as well. That also is new in Vietnam.
And destabilizing a dynamic which everybody wants the whole thing tied up. Even in this country, as we conveniently forget about it or have superficial stuff, we want it all, well, we made a mistake, no, it's only the liberal media or the liberal Congress is the reason why we lost. Whatever the spectrum of stuff, it's always neat, and none of it is neat.
So a quick question before we leave this, because it actually comes up, there's one person from one of the Vietnamese soldiers in the film who actually says, please take care to how you use my interview. Had there been any, to your knowledge, any repercussions at all for any of the North Vietnamese in particular who participated?
No. I mean, we showed him the film. You know, he's just the gentleman that was on there. He's a very interesting guy. We didn't put him in on air without his permission. There's nothing to worry about with him. He's a very high-ranking communist. Still has the card and everything. A lot of them, the communist side here is not all together. We have very different opinions. Now they're older men and women, and they have different opinions. But you don't have to worry about that guy.
Can I just say something?
He's a good guy, but he's all set, right?
I'd just like to add quickly that the consensus of the people who've seen it in Vietnam, and I've only known the reaction from a handful of people, is that this film is very objective and that it portrays the war as it happened. So it's been a very positive reaction. People are grateful to get another view of the war because they don't trust the official narrative. And the official narrative in Vietnam is the narrative of the winning side. So it's always about the great victories, the fight against foreign domination, and a lot of things have been swept under the rug, and this film exposes a lot of that. So people are actually very grateful to get a very more complicated, nuanced view of what happened.
Yeah. No, that's okay. You can save it. So yeah, we have one more clip, and at some point soon we'll come to the audience for questions. But reconciliation is probably another overused word. It's largely the theme of the closing elements of the film, and it's incredibly well done, I think, also. So if we can show an episode, this is from the final episode, episode 10, Reconciliation.
Con số anh em ở thành phố thì cũng hay gặp những cựu binh Mỹ. Họ không biết tiếng. Họ chỉ gặp rồi mừng với nhau rồi ôm với nhau vậy thôi, chứ thương binh này thương binh kia vẫn bình thường. Thì tụi tôi là coi như quá khứ xóa bỏ. Mặc dầu tôi thương tích trong mình, kể cả đạn còn trong người, nhưng mà đó là cái chiến tranh, cho nên nó dẹp lại. Bây giờ mình lấy cái hiện tại để cho tương lai con cháu mình mai sau đặng nó còn phải sang bên kia nó học những cái hay, cái tốt, cái đẹp bên xứ người nữa chứ, còn giao lưu với người ta nữa chứ.
I went back to Vietnam. I got in touch with a provincial vets organization. This is a huge organization of Vietnamese vets, all former enemies, but now mellowed quite a bit, like me. The guys my age, grandpas. And after we got past the initial checking each other out, and is this a political thing or not, they could not have been more gracious and more loving. They took me under their wing like a brother soldier. We exchanged painful memories, stories, and I did a little ceremony honoring the guys I lost, honoring the Vietnamese enemies that we'd killed, and just telling them, they could be at peace now. It was a wonderful, wonderful trip. You don't get closure, but you get some peace. You get some peace. I got some peace.
Beautiful.
So, I don't think I'm giving away or ruining the episode this evening, but Tommy gave, as I said, and flippantly, the title of it, and he's talking about the experience of war for young men. And he says it's the history of the world, and it really is. And it's such a horrible thing that we do. But he's absolutely right. It is the history of the world. I don't know if you can find any time where there has been peace in the history of humankind. I think Will and Ariel Durant tried and found 17 years, but I'm sure they missed something. And this is what we do, and we never actually account for it. And I think our film was an attempt to try to, as we've done in the Civil War and the Second World War, which has that horrible illness of being the good war when it's actually the worst war ever, to sort of say, hey, look, this is what human beings do. This is the history of the world. Young 18-year-olds trying not to be killed and ending up, in order not to being killed, to kill, so they can tell stories to their grandchildren, as Tommy says. And then you see Mike Haney, who is an Army grunt who we've followed, from New Jersey, and he's a wonderful human being. And you see what happens, as is our Viet Cong guerrilla, who we spent most of the entire series with. A few people are in almost every episode. The Bill Zimmerman, the anti-war guy. So there's huge kind of continuities for a lot of people throughout the film. And you just sort of look at that, and after 10 years, I really wish all we could do was like the back half of episode 10, that we could just skip to the reconciliation part, because we're going to do it. We're going to figure out how to do it. We're going to be able to say, I can just remember growing up, apologize to your brother. No. Apologize to your brother. No. Young man, apologize to your brother. Okay, I'm sorry. No, say it and you mean it. Right? So this is the history of the world. And there's something about these two men up there, but also this man here, in which, you just wish somehow, it's not ever going to happen, but it's a documentary filmmaker's sort of, ridiculous thing that we could skip to that part.
So Tom, I met when I came, a shout out to the Asia Society and the good work that you're doing. In the front here is Danny Russell, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Asia and Pacific and the Obama administration, and we don't have one of these now. I don't think anyone's taken your place yet in the State Department. So I went into Danny's office before I went out to see you, Ken, and I said, Danny, are we going to have a war? And he said, well, I don't think so. And so I think with the help of the Asia Society and their team, I think they are trying to at least delay the next one. And so Asia Society, we're grateful for the good work that you do, and Danny's nice to see you.
So the word modest was used to describe Tom Vallely. I'm not going to let you. First of all, thank you. That was very, very kind and unnecessary, but we appreciate it. But the phrase we used earlier about a person who's done as much as anyone for reconciliation. So Tom has started basically a Fulbright University in Vietnam, right? So your record there is incredible, and I'm sure will continue. But just there, I was jotting down some words used in that last clip. Mellowed, we're at peace now. Vietnamese said we've put the past behind us. Does that ring true to you, or to my Elliott? Do you? Well, the gentleman you see where the youngsters are coming down said, I want to send my grandchildren to. We use that now. I've got permission from PBS, and so it helps to be the senior advisor. That's part of the Fulbright.
We charge them an arm and a leg.
That's a Fulbright. We use that clip in our. That's a great, and I think there's anxiety in Vietnam now about the relationship between the United States and Vietnam, which is quite strong. There's been a lot of terrific diplomats, some of them are in this room, that have built a really strong relationship with the United States. I think they're now, people in Vietnam, a lot of people, it's not, they want to be able to connect to the rest of the world. And I think they're worried about the Trump immigration policy. People in Vietnam have anxiety. They want to go to the United States. They want those kids, those youngsters, they want them to go to college in America. They want that experience. They're worried that we're not going to have that experience anymore. And I think that causes great anxiety in Vietnam. And I think the relationship the United States has with Vietnam is quite remarkable now. We didn't show the end of the film, but Ken wants to make a big film about President Obama, and we put him in the end of the film when Danny Russell and others are making sure that President Obama's trip to Vietnam is historic. We have some of that, and it's quite, you'll choke up when you see it. But we did build an extremely interesting relationship with Vietnam, and I think that will sustain itself, and I think we'll survive, and I hope the history of the world doesn't repeat itself, but we learned a lot in Vietnam. I personally think Vietnam strengthened the U.S.
My Elliott, we can't leave the audience with a tease of what happened with your sister, but any other reflections on that, and we'll come to questions.
Yeah, well, Vietnamese history is several thousand years long, and throughout that long history, there have been a lot of foreigners coming in trying to tell us how we should run our country, taking over. We always fought them, drove them away. So this latest war is one of those, and people can put it behind, and they're very focused on the present because there are a lot more opportunities now. And they forget, of all the times I've been back to Vietnam, there was only one time early on at the end of the war when I was met with some hostility. I was traveling with some American tourists, and somebody in Binh Dinh, the hotbed of communist revolution. looked at me and said, "Lucky of the foreigners." But that was the only time. Since then, I've never encountered any ill will. And like Tom said, a lot of Vietnamese now want to come to this country, want to send their children here to study. I've just read a statistic, something like over 60,000 Vietnamese college students are now in the U.S.
Wow.
So the U.S. is the big beacon of hope, opportunity, freedom. They recognize that, and they kind of recognize that the American involvement was basically an aberration, and that they still respect America and American values. So, what was the other part of your question?
Just your own reconciliation within your family.
Within my own family, yes. That's, finally, I was reunited with my sister, and it had been over 40 years when I had last seen her. And, I must say I had a lot of trepidation. I hadn't seen her in a long time. I had married an American. In the meantime, how would she receive me? But she and her family received me with open arms. So I realized that the family bond, I come from a very traditional family, and family bonds are very strong for us. So the family bond held, and she and I was reunited, and it was a very emotional, satisfactory occasion. It's as if 40 years, the revolution, the war, nothing had happened. So that was a very beautiful reunion for us.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll go to questions. Just want to acknowledge 4 people in the room, and I'm probably going to miss out on others. We normally, at this point, will acknowledge supporters and trustees, and we have them too here, but just some Vietnam connections. Rick Mayo Smith is with us, founding chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ho Chi Minh City back in 1994, active player in the normalization process. Paul Batista here, lawyer, novelist, servant in Vietnam. He has the, I don't know how rare a distinction this is, to have been involved first in the anti-war movement and then getting a draft card and going. Very often it was the other way around. Tom mentioned Ambassador Ray Burkhart, who's with us. Began his foreign service career in Vietnam in 1970, was a political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, worked on refugee issues, I believe, Vietnamese refugee issues in Hong Kong after the war, and later served as United States Ambassador to Vietnam. Delighted to have you. Last but not least, Tom Vallely, you're not the only Silver Star recipient in the room, and there may be more, but I want to welcome recipient of 2 Bronze Stars and the Silver Star for Valor in an October 1967 battle in Loc Ninh, not in the film, Ronald Campsey from East Quogue, New York. Welcome. All right, let's start in the front row. We'll take those to the gentleman in the red tie and on next to. We'll pass microphones, and let's do it quickly because I see a lot of hands. And if you could keep it just brief if you can. I know I haven't been so brief, but please.
You indicated that you tried not to express bias, but that it might be difficult to have done so. To what extent have you received any criticism for having had bias on one side or the other, and how have you responded?
Well, there's no such thing as objectivity. That's what I wanted to say. The only objectivity is coming from God, and she's not telling. So let me just say that I'll go to my Civil War film. There were many people on what you could, I suppose, call the right who felt that we were too unsympathetic to what we'd call the lost cause and the perpetuation of white supremacy. On the far, far left, there were people concerned that we had not spent enough time in Congress with the radical Republican Congress that had helped to begin to transform and remake America through amendments to the Constitution and the institution of Reconstruction. I would say that the comments to this, and they've been so modest, are coming in that same predictable fashion, that we have successfully checked those things at the door, that we have tried very hard, though we permitted our talking heads to say exactly what they felt, that we were able to actually permit them to have the points of view, and more importantly, to create a space in which those points of view could all be honored, that we didn't make someone wrong by the fact that there's someone of an opposite point of view. And so you have that throughout the film, and that permits you to then adhere, as we spent 10 years trying to do, to the actual facts. I mean, if you're going to do the Civil War, you better know that on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg happens. If you see a film in which it doesn't take place on any of those days, you don't have to pay attention to anything more. We wanted to get the July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd right of this film. We think we have. But within it, we've permitted lots of voices. And in this case, not just a Confederate and a Union voice, or a Confederate home person at home front and Union home front, or the presidents, Davis and Lincoln, but dozens of different perspectives. And so we feel very proud of it, and I don't think you'll find a thumb on the scale with regard to the overall narrative direction.
Don, you have a question?
Yes. Hi. So, admittedly, I binge watched 3 episodes last night. Hi.
How do you feel this morning? Do you want to? You can sit down if you'd like to.
Oh, well. Anyway, it's more intense than Game of Thrones. I have to say.
And real and American made. I just want to say.
Yes, of course. I just want to first applaud you for this Herculean task. I think it's a very complex topic, and I think there are inherent biases in how each of us view the war based on our personal experiences. In my case, I came to the U.S. as a political refugee on the last day of the war. My father flew a Huey. He was at Yabi, the Lac, which was the west point of Vietnam, and he flew us onto the U.S. as Midway. So growing up in that environment, we were not allowed, well, we resettled in New Orleans, but we were not allowed to watch any Hollywood movies on Vietnam. My parents did not like the portrayals. You know, Vietnamese people were peasants, prostitutes. That wasn't the narrative they wanted us to see. My father always said the losers in any war never gets to share their history. They never get to write the history. And he said, sadly, this war has been not so kind for people like him and other South Vietnamese. And growing up in the Vietnamese-American community, I've seen alcoholism, I've seen depression, and I've been to one funeral after the next where, you know, the South Vietnamese veterans say, tell our story, tell our side of the story. So when this documentary came up, I told my dad about it, and I said, look, it's exciting. Dad was skeptical, and I said, no. Tom Vallely is the senior advisor. Tommy has been my mentor. He was my former boss. And
I hate to cut you short, but if you do have a question, just because there's so many folks
I know.
But, yeah.
It's a quick question, but I went, with an open mind, to a New York Times panel discussion, and one of the first things that Carl Merlantis said was, we fought on the wrong side. Now that stung me, and I'm sure people like my father would be stung by that comment as well. 250,000 dead. So my question is, but having seen some of the episodes, I think you have a very balanced perspective. My question is to Elliott. You've spent a lot of time researching the North Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. How, and you've characterized them as intrepid, patriotic. How would you characterize the average South Vietnamese? Because not everyone was corrupt and incompetent as their leaders. Yeah. And I would also like to ask, what has been the reaction from the Vietnamese diaspora? Because we number the millions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, my answer is that the tragedy of South Vietnam was that a lot of South Vietnamese soldiers fought valiantly, accepted their sacrifices. Their families went through horrendous sacrifices, experiences, just as bad as what the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong went through. But the tragedy was that they never got the leadership they deserved that allowed them to win the battle at the end. And that is the tragedy. And if you want to know the answers to the question of why the South Vietnamese lost, I would recommend that you read the Rand Corporation report on the fall of South Vietnam. A couple of Rand analysts interviewed senior South Vietnamese generals, officers, South Vietnamese officials who fled to the U.S. right at the end of the war. And they analyzed why their side lost. And basically they said the reason they lost, the cancer that caused the death of South Vietnam was the incompetent leadership and the corruption. And I think that is the tragedy of South Vietnam.
And could I just add one footnote? The losers do not write the histories, the winners do, except in the occasion of the American Civil War, in which case the losers have written the history, and we've suffered from that ever since, and Charlottesville is exactly the example of that. So beware of that.
Sorry, we'll take one right here. And then to the gentleman in the back. If you can get a microphone to the, yeah.
Giusetta Capriati, Foreign Policy Association. In 1969, I was a foreign student at Brandeis University, and I demonstrated on campus along with all the American students against the Vietnam War. Later in life, I went to Vietnam. I went all over, from Along Bay to Ho Chi Minh City. And I asked all the Vietnamese people I met, do you hold it against Americans? Everybody answered to me, no. They said our worst enemy was, is, and will always be China.
China, yeah. Yeah, I think that was the tragedy of the Vietnam War. The United States thought it was containing communism, keeping China from taking over Asia, but actually the Vietnamese fear China more than they fear anybody else. Yes, yes. Our whole history was fighting China.
Yes, sir.
Hi, John McAuliffe from the Fund for Reconciliation
Hi, John.
and Development.
Hi, John.
Friend of many.
Hi, John.
Have spent most of my adult life involved, certainly in the post-war normalization work. I have totally mixed feelings. I've now binge-watched and then re-watched.
We would know you'd have mixed feelings, John.
Right, of course.
That's not a big surprise to anybody.
There's also very critical opinion out there from a lot of scholars and a lot of anti-war activists, and that needs to get factored in. But I just wanted to ask two questions. One is the definition of civil war maybe ought to get talked about here too, because under the description you're giving, the American Revolution was a civil war. There was clear division. There were people both about how to achieve independence and whether there should be independence. There were also massive refugee flight. So, you know, I think...
Let me do that.
I think we got
all right, let me ask the particular concern from a lot of anti-war folks is that the texture, the complexity of the anti-war movement and the complexity of NGO workers in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia are not included. The fact that there was this consistent, I mean, Tommy has done absolutely wonderful work, but he wasn't the first. I mean, all of the NGOs were working in Vietnam after the end of the war. And Bobby Muller and Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation had taken a big veterans group. So there's lots and lots of stuff that you couldn't maybe fit in 18 hours,
right.
but there is concern that the full picture, and one of the things I'd say is the Pentagon March, it also goes only halfway. It never gets to the 600 people arrested.
John, there's so many people with hands. I think we got
steps.
Civil War and...
All right, well, let me just invite people to Washington on October 21st for the 50th anniversary of the Pentagon March.
We consider it the highest praise when we have an 18-hour film and we are criticized for what we left out, actually. Seriously, I mean, honestly, our film is not the last word. It's opening a conversation. We have included things we thought we could include. We started with a lot more material, as we usually do. And I think it's really we are happy to have this conversation, but I think there are a lot more people with questions. So I think we,
I've given the mic to this gentleman, and then Missy Rennie, somebody I know by name, over here.
Thank you. Ambassador Paul Speltz. So with the white hair, I was there, but I was also there right after we unofficially started opening the door. But I want to congratulate you, first of all, because I was surprised that in a film you showed things about from the North Vietnamese and what the North Vietnamese generals were showing about the bravery of the American soldiers. That didn't come out here. That's okay. You have a few minutes. So I think, although it wasn't so objective on your panel there, you did do a pretty objective job of doing it. And I'll remember one thing Vo Van Ket said to me when I went back in on a mission. He said, you have to reach the point where Vietnam, to us, is a country. To you, Vietnam is a war. And you now are moving in that direction. Very nice job.
You know what, I would just like to add something to that and also address the earlier question, because it's really important to understand, though at 18 hours, as Lynn is saying, it's still just a story. And we've made decisions about that. It's not an encyclopedia. We can't list all of that. But an interesting and maybe comforting or maybe further antagonizing thing is a late screening of the film. It was basically done. We were pulled aside by two people. One, I would say, would be someone who was involved in the anti-war thing. And they said, look, you have really done a spectacular job covering the soldiers and the honor of them, and that's really, really great. I don't think you've done enough on the anti-war movement. We were pulled aside by someone else, that very soldier-type person, and said, look, you covered the anti-war movement all up and down in every possible dimension. I don't think you've really covered the part, we tend to see things from our own biases, and we tend to be blinded to the fact that quite often the thing that we want to be told in great detail isn't there. If you're born and grow up in Chicago in the 1950s and a series on the history of baseball doesn't do the 1959 White Sox but does the 1919 Black Sox, you're pissed.
Yeah. You never forget a single fact from any of your documentaries, do you? No.
Well, that's what it said in the New Yorker.
Okay.
Let me answer a little bit of the question about the Civil War. We very consciously asked. I went back to Vietnam and spoke to one of the participants in the film, who's a big star in the film. He's a Vietnamese public intellectual. His name is Nguyen Nop. And we were struggling with what weight to put on Civil War versus War of National Liberation, War of Survival. We were completely conscious of knowing we had to navigate that space. And I went to see Mr. Nguyen Nop, and I asked Mr. Nguyen Nop, in your opinion, is the Vietnam War a civil war, or is the Vietnam War a war of national liberation? And he looks at me and says, I think about it every day, and I don't know. And that's why we put him in the film.
I think it was both.
Both, it's both.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's both.
Right, it's not an either
it's
or.
both. He said it's, so we
not
put it,
either
and
or.
that's in there, and
Right.
we have that covered in the film.
Right.
Ken has not left for good. He's coming back in a second. I still think we probably have just time for one more. And you
comes back and see my position.
You're going to wait till Ken comes back. Okay. Yes, we give one to the ambassador here, and then we're going to need to. We'll come to Missy, and then we got to wrap.
Since John McAuliffe explained to us why it really wasn't he was unhappy with it being a civil war, I just felt compelled to ask a contrary question. John and I go back a long way this way, so I was surprised actually, maybe at least in the first 7 episodes, that there wasn't any characterization of the South, a description of who these people were, who in the South felt in some cases very intensely that they did not want to be under a government rule from Hanoi or by the NLF, and the religious groups like the Catholics, the Wahao, to some extent the Cao Dai, that there were political parties. There were strong political leaders in the South, a few, very few, who were in some very famous cases very deliberately targeted and assassinated by the communists. And so you didn't have that sort of sense of the political depth that existed there in that opposition. And I was wondering whether that was something that was considered, or that was just it got left on the cutting board. You couldn't have a 20-hour movie. So.
I mean, we have to keep a lot of balls in the air, narratively speaking, and we do have some of that, and not as much as you would like, but maybe someone else would have wanted less. Some of that we cover in our book in greater detail, where we have more room to explain. So, we definitely touch on it, and there's a place where it came up last night, actually, but, there's a lot more than what's in the film, and we just had to make a lot of choices to kind of move the narrative along. So.
It is amazing, though. I mean, and it stands to
I mean,
reason that in an 18-hour film, something still is on the cutting room floor.
Oh, an enormous amount is on the cutting room floor. The cutting room floor is
Ray, I don't agree. I
but,
think South
yeah.
Vietnam is portrayed strongly in the film. I think the idea of South Vietnam, how South Vietnam was groping with how to build a nation. I think the film covers the ground of the complications that Ngo Dinh Diem had and the inability that Ngo Dinh Diem has in creating South Vietnam and how he is not inclusive, that we spent a fair amount of time on why that didn't gel. And I think that's covered really, really well in the film. We also spend a fair amount of time with the group of people who want to conduct the South Vietnam War differently. Chun Nap Cho, Rufus Phillips, John Van. I think we're trying to get into that people that want to change the politics of Ngo Dinh Diem can't change Ngo Dinh Diem's ideas about nation building. I think we give a fair amount of coverage to them. I understand what you're saying. There are different leaders that we might have been able to put in there, but I think the story of why South Vietnam doesn't seem to have as Mai was describing, doesn't seem to have the cohesiveness of the other side. I think the film does justice to that idea.
I think the testimony of Phan Quang Thuy is very important to that. His family is very prominent.
Thuy is good, yeah.
And he's extraordinarily important.
He's more's coming on Thuy.
Exactly. You're going to see more of him.
We've resolved everything in your absence,
Yes,
Ken.
go ahead.
But we did.
Some people don't want to ask any questions until you get back, Mr. Ken.
All right.
I
Missy.
just wanted to ask Ken and Lynn a question about the filmmaking part of it, because I grew up in the television news business, as did Tom. My husband was going to be drafted, enlisted as a Marine officer, was on the DMZ, and was wounded in 1969. I'm in 1967, and I'm seeing material and footage that I cannot believe existed. Was this archival material that you found? I mean, I watch television every day. I did not see these things on television. I was still sort of perplexed by what we should be doing.
The misnomer is that this was the first television war, that somehow we saw this stuff, all the stuff, live. It didn't happen that way. We saw a very selected, very judiciously selected amount of material, so that when we go back to the archives, instead of spending a year, we're spending 10 years, and we can do deep dives into the archives. We can request, from the outtakes of newsreel shows. We can get the original camera rolls. We can find material, and we can also take advantage of the end of the Cold War that permits us to look at archives beyond our normal community of places that we would do. And so we've a lot of it is just the spade work and the due diligence necessary to find that stuff, and then figure out a way to incorporate it.
And so in some ways, this now has been the time when you've been able to do this, whereas 20 years ago, we might not have had the same product.
I would assume that would be the case, but we never say never. We kind of are tenacious in that regard.
We have to wrap it there. Just two quick notes. Number one, this is actually the warm-up act for the Colbert Show, which is where you'll find Ken Burns tonight, which I can assure you the Age of Society...
and I are not invited.
The Age of Society has never been the warm-up for anything at Stephen Colbert's shop. And then back to where I started with UN General Assembly stuff. Foreign Minister of Pakistan here this evening, Foreign Minister of Iran with Charlie Rose tomorrow. If you're interested in tickets, let somebody know or go to agesociety.org. One more time, huge thanks to Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, Tom Vallely, and Mai Elliott. Thank you.